You're here because you want to make delicious pour-over coffee and you want an A to Z on making delicious pour-over coffee, and I'm here to teach you. Let's do it. Hello, fellow fans and coffee lovers everywhere. My name is Haley. I am your local resident Q grader and an ex-barista with 8+ years experience in the specialty coffee industry, and I'm here to teach you the A to Z, an intro to brewing the most delicious pour over, and how to troubleshoot your brewing and what to look for, and just everything about making a delicious cup of pour over coffee. You may be thinking, why would I want to brew my coffee as pour over, Haley? Why would I want to do this instead of making, say, a French press? Or is pour over right for me? First, let's get into what pour over is. Pour over coffee, aka drip coffee, or sometimes called filter coffee, is a gravity-dependent brew method made by putting coffee into a filter, which then goes into what we call a dripper, and then usually that dripper is placed on a vessel of your choice. I mean, it should be, otherwise the coffee just drips out onto your counter, which is not preferable. And that's the whole method, right? So you're pouring your water over the coffee in the filter that is in the dripper on top of a vessel. Pour over coffee offers a lot of control in the final outcome of your cup of coffee, right? It offers complexity, it offers a generally clean, right? So not super sedimenty, not any kind of murky, just very clean, crisp, complex cup of coffee, because you're pouring slowly over your grounds, soaking everything evenly inside of the filter, inside of the dripper. So that is what pour over is, and oftentimes it's super preferable to people because of that cleanness in your cup, that degree of control over the final outcome, because of the control of water flow. And it really offers a lot of defined flavors from the coffee in the cup. Also, where pour-over differs from something like, say, French press, is that this paper filter offers some degree of soaking up some of the natural oils in the coffee, right? So kind of pulling back a lot of the otherwise maybe more robust, more forward flavors. It makes for a complex cup, but not quite as bold as something as, say, like French press, where a French press has a metal filter, no oils are soaked up, and also in a French press, all of the coffee and the water is in the same chamber, whereas there's some separation between coffee and final product of brewed coffee immediately with pour over. Okay, so you've decided that pour over is for you. Complex, clean, the degree of control of what comes out flavor-wise in your cup, you're ready to go. What do you need to brew pour over coffee? First and foremost, one of the most important pieces of equipment to control the outcome of your cup of coffee is the grinder. Grinding your coffee fresh right before you brew allows for the maximum amount of gases to activate and then create flavors in your final cup. The nerdy version of that is that gases get sealed, natural gases get sealed into the coffee beans as we roast them, and these gases help create final flavor. Gases and oils help create final flavor in the cup of coffee. When you grind your beans, right, you are breaking them up, so you're causing the gases to release exponentially faster than they would just sitting as whole beans. Like they'll release naturally as whole beans, but so much faster will they release as ground coffee, which is why it is not a myth. It is very important and makes a huge difference to grind your coffee right before you brew. A grinder will also allow you to dictate grind size. Grind sizes for any brew method will vary, of course. There's a range of grind settings for pour over coffee. There's a fine end, right, small particles, and a coarse end of the range, and then right in the middle of kind of a just right area. If you are an Ode or an Opus user, one of our grinders, there is a range of settings on the inside lid of the grinder that should help you out. I generally like to stick around somewhere in the middle of the range when I'm grinding with our grinders. Every grinder is going to have a different range of grind settings pertaining to their numbers, so it's really important to get to know your grinder and what number means what setting-wise, but super important to have a grinder. Next, you'll need a gooseneck kettle. The gooseneck is this long, skinny spout. That's what we call a gooseneck. The long, skinny spout will allow you to pour very slowly and control the direction of your pour because you want to, which is important because you want to soak your grounds very evenly. Next, you will need a dripper. So you can use a dripper like ours. It's what we call a flat bottom dripper. It has a flat bottom and a number of evenly dispersed small exit holes, controlling water flow to be a bit slower. You could also instead opt for what's called a conical dripper. It's more conical, cone-shaped, and it usually has a large exit hole on the bottom, making for a bit quicker of water flow. That's up to preference. There are differences to each dripper for sure. And again, it's all up to preference. The way that I think about it is because a flat bottom dripper has slower flow water-wise, it can be a little bit more hands-off at times. It can be a little bit more forgiving, whereas a conical dripper can generally require more motion, more attentiveness. I heard it once compared to driving an automatic car versus a stick shift car, and honestly, once you get into it, I think that makes a lot of sense. Second to last, but very important, you will need coffee. I'm using 22 grams of coffee in to 350 grams of water out. We'll get into why a little bit later, but you do need some coffee to make pour-over coffee. And finally, I'm using a scale. It is really it's not necessary to have a scale, like not 100%, but it is a really, really incredible tool and super helpful to use to troubleshoot what's going on, to know how much coffee you're using, to know how much water you're brewing with and all that kind of stuff. The ratio of water to coffee is really important in knowing what you can do to edit your brew in order to make delicious and repeatable outcomes as you hone your technique. So scale, super important to weigh that coffee, to weigh that water. It helps to use the timer on scales as well to see how long your brew was, how quick it was, and that can also inform you on what maybe to change for your next brew, right? As you do what we call dialing in, which is dialing each bit of your method and your technique to create an optimal outcome. So scale, very helpful for weighing the coffee, for weighing the water, and also for timing your brew. Okay, so you have all of your gear lined up and now you're ready to brew. One more thing before we brew though, you want to take your hot water, heat it up to 205 degrees, which is generally a good spot that we find to start. Some coffees, like lighter roasts, will require more temperature. Some more roasted coffees will require less temperature, and depending on the coffee, temperature can vary, but we generally stick between 200 and 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which is boiling, and again, starting at 205, which is just off boiling. So the first thing you want to do is pre-wet your filter. So I started in the middle to make sure that my filter was sitting down into the dripper, right, flush with the bottom, and then I went around the sides, and you can even go around the sides a couple more times because this serves two purposes. The first purpose it serves, it's kind of a tongue twister, is to get that initial papery layer out of the filter and so it doesn't impart itself into your final product. And also it serves to pre-warm your dripper as well as your vessel. Coffee can tend to change flavor effects and flavor notes, I guess, with rapid temperature changes. So you're trying to control it. You're trying to have hot water go through coffee and then hot coffee drips into an already warmed vessel as opposed to dripping into a cold vessel and taking on different flavor effects. Cool, so your pre-wet, pre-warmed filter is inside of your pre-warmed dripper and vessel. Let's grab that coffee. So I pre-ground my coffee so that we didn't have to do that in this video, but remember to grind right before you brew if you can. I will go ahead and carefully pour my coffee into my dripper. Now that your coffee is in your dripper, you want to grab your dripper and gently shake it side to side. This will level out your bed of grounds. You want it to be flat and even. If you're pouring into a bed of grounds that's not even, some places will have a lot of coffee, some places will have not very much, meaning water will pass through a lot in some places and not very much in other places, which promotes what we call uneven extraction, right? You're pulling out, you're extracting a bunch from some areas and not too much from other areas, which can cause not super preferable flavor effects in the outcome. We'll talk more about extraction in the frequently asked questions, the FAQ section, at the end of this brew demo. So hold on for that. Okay, so we're ready for our first pour. I'm going to, now that I have everything on my scale, gonna go ahead and tear it out so everything reads 0, because now what we're gonna monitor, if you're using a scale, is the amount of water that we are putting in to this whole apparatus. First pour is very important. It's what we call a bloom. You're blooming the coffee. You're allowing that first set of gases to activate and release once you hit them with water. This step is really important because it really is what gives your coffee the ability to have that flavor delineation, to have that definition. It's really allowing the coffee to open up. So generally I use 2 times the amount of water as coffee that I put in. So I use 22 grams of coffee. I'm gonna pour up to 44 grams reading on my scale, so about double. You just wanna make sure that you're getting all of the grounds soaking evenly, right? So you're not having any, you don't have any islands floating around in there. You just want everything soaked evenly. To do that, I pour in concentric circles, much like a snail shell, right? In to out or out to in, doesn't matter as long as you are constantly in motion and getting everything soaking evenly. So here we go. Without further ado, our first pour, and I started my timer as well right at the same time. And again, I am pouring up to about 44 grams. If you go a little bit over, not a huge deal. For instance, I'm about 3 grams over on this first pour. Again, not a huge deal. The biggest objective here is to get everything soaking evenly. You don't want to go too far over and flood it with water, however, because you don't want to pull too much out right away. I generally let my blooms sit between 30 and 40 seconds, or just as you start to see the water kind of disappear and as the grounds sort of dry out. And then the second pour, again in even concentric circles, I'm going to pour up to 150 grams. I'm doing this pour in about 10 seconds. I'm controlling that variable so I know that I wouldn't have to change that in order to troubleshoot for my next cup of coffee, right? So you're just trying to control any variable you can in the brewing process. So we're going for our third pour up to 250 grams reading on the scale. Again, concentric circles all the way through and up to 250 grams for about 10 seconds. Again, I like to think of a snail shell, right? So like that Fibonacci sequence kind of swirly guy. That is the scientific term, I think, for it. I don't know. I just make coffee. I definitely don't know too much about math. So I think of a snail shell when I'm pouring to make sure that I keep kind of on that track. I also want to make sure that I am keeping on an even level plane when I'm pouring. I'm not going high to low. Some techniques involve a high to low pour. I like to keep mine on this even plane so that, again, I am controlling the variable of increased velocity at some points versus decreased velocity at other points. So I'm keeping that the same brew to brew so that when I go to troubleshoot, I can change things in like an order of operations. Like changing everything before I change my technique. My technique is like the foundation that I place great brews on. After this last pour, just let it drip. You don't want to pour too much over or too much under. Again, try to stick around within 0.5 grams above or below, but if you're a couple grams above or below, it's not a huge deal. Let's get into some frequently asked questions. Okay, first question. How do you know what the ratio should be? 16:1 water to coffee is a good place to start. It's a general good rule of thumb across the board. However, knowing what your ratio specific to the coffee that you're brewing should be definitely comes with the coffee. Some coffees will require a little bit more, some will require a little bit less. That's about testing it out, right? So if you brew the coffee at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio and you're like, wow, this could be a bit stronger for my taste, use a little bit more coffee. Or if you think the opposite, wow, this coffee's a little bit too strong, maybe you want to dial it back and use a little bit less coffee. But starting at 16:1 is generally a good rule of thumb. All right, next question. What are categories and variables of what could be wrong / not preferable? First of all, there's nothing that's truly wrong in coffee. How you enjoy it is how you enjoy it. But if you are looking to dial in your technique and just looking for what generally is looked for in a good or bad extraction or a good or bad brew, quote unquote. Generally speaking, coffees that are too sour or weak, right? So like at the end, it's just finishing too sour. Through the middle, it's kind of watery. It's not really got a lot of body going on. You probably could add a little bit of what we call agitation. So giving the dripper a few swirls in between pours. Or you can adjust your grind size. So you can adjust it to be just a little bit finer. So you're, causing the water to flow a little bit more slowly through the coffee and pull a little bit more out. Or you could use a little bit more coffee. The last thing I would change on that in that whole situation would probably be water temperature. You might want to go a little bit hotter. But again, I would go for probably grind size or agitation first, and then I would use more coffee, and then I would think about changing the water temperature. On the opposite end, something that is a brew that is maybe too bitter, chalky, drying at the end, maybe it has too much body in the middle, you might have caused what we call over extraction, which is pulling too much out of the coffee, right? So I might dial the grind setting back a little bit, make it a little bit coarser so the water flows through a little bit quicker. I might use less agitation, less swirls if I added any agitation at all. I might use less coffee, or at the very end, if all of that's not working, I might dial it back and turn the temperature of my water down a little bit. Next frequently asked question, which is a really important one, why is grind setting so important? Imagine, if you will, we're going on a journey. 2 buckets, both have holes poked at the bottom, just 2, utility buckets. One is filled with stones that are about fist sized, one is filled with coarse sand. So when you pour water into these buckets, one of them, the water will flow out, whereas the other, the water will stick around a little bit longer, and probably the final product of water will look a little bit different than the water that's coming out of the bucket that has bigger rocks in it, right? That's how I imagine coarse versus finer grind settings with coffee. Water passing through big particles, not going to pull out quite as much as water passing through and taking its time passing through a bunch of smaller particles, if that makes sense. Grind size is really important because it's really what helps you control how much or how little you pull out of your coffee. So it really controls extraction, which again, extraction is just what you pull out of the coffee. Another frequently asked question is, why would you pour this way instead of on a varying plane? Some folks use an up and down pour. I prefer to use a pour that is on an even level plane, because then I know 100% that my water flow is going to be very similar throughout my pours, which varying water flow can sometimes, if you're at the top, over agitate or cause particles to bump into each other because of the higher velocity. At a different rate they're bumping into each other, whereas when you're lower down, there's less agitation rate. Particles of coffee are not bumping into each other as much, and so sometimes you are agitating a bunch and sometimes you're agitating only a little bit, and that can be a harder variable to control. So I prefer to, if I am adding agitation, I'm not adding it by my pour, I am adding it by actually swirling the dripper, just so I can keep control of those variables. You can feel free to check out more frequently asked questions in our blog post, or feel free to drop comments on any of our social media platforms, including this video. Thank you all for joining me today. Again, I have been and will continue to be Haley, your local resident Q grader. I hope this clears up a bit on how to make a pour-over from start to finish. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions at all. We always love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.